Hi guys, in this video we will be learning about international migration and its implications, as well as answering an exam-style question.
So in previous videos we've learnt about population change and how this changes in relation to changes in birth rate, death rate, life expectancy, all in relation to development. But also another major component of population change is migration. And the geographical definition of migration is the movement of people across a specified boundary in order to establish either a new permanent settlement or a semi-permanent residence. And migration can take place at a variety of scales and is a result of a number of factors which we're going to look at in this video. And whatever the factor is, essentially, it's going to have an impact on the population structure, and also it's going to have impacts essentially on both the countries of origin, which is where the migrants are coming from, and their destination countries as well. And we're going to look at some of these impacts later on in the video too. So essentially we have three different types of migrants, and they all have very different characteristics. We have asylum seekers, economic migrants, and refugees. Now, asylum seekers are people who are fleeing their country of origin, and essentially they are saying to their destination country that they physically cannot return to their country of origin because of a fear of death or persecution. And whilst they wait for their asylum application to be concluded, they are referred to as asylum seekers. These are people that could be fleeing for political persecution. A lot of people flee because of their sexuality or religious persecution as well. For example, in Iran and other Muslim countries, it's illegal to be gay, essentially. So a lot of gay men flee these countries for fear of being persecuted and killed for their sexuality. Then we have economic migrants, and these are people who have voluntarily left their country of origin, so very different from asylum seekers. This can be in a lawful or unlawful manner, and they are essentially seeking employment in another country. And then lastly, we have refugees. Refugees are very similar to asylum seekers, but there's two kind of classifications of refugees we have. So one type is when an asylum seeker has had their application to kind of move to another country and stay there legally. They are called refugees, so they're essentially successful asylum seekers. But the other type of refugees are people fleeing their countries, but not for fear of persecution, but they could be fleeing for things like natural disasters or civil war instead. So that's the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker. And these are the three different types of migration that we have. So now we're going to look at the causes of migration, and these can be split into push factors and pull factors. So push factors are factors which are kind of forcing people out of their current country of origin, and the pull factors are the factors which are kind of the good factors which are drawing people to move to another country. And we're going to look at the different types of push and pull factors now. So starting with push factors. Push factors could be things like war, conflict and political instability, ethnic and religious persecution. So this would relate to reasons why asylum seekers would be leaving. Also natural and man-made disasters. Sometimes when there's hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, people have to flee the area, and often they are crossing a national border to escape the impact of the disaster. Also socioeconomic conditions like unemployment, low wages, or poor working conditions. So they want to move elsewhere where they can improve their prospects, essentially. And also food shortages also push people out of countries to find food elsewhere. Then the pull factors of our destination countries, they are mostly associated with voluntary migration, because essentially the people that are being pushed out of their countries don't really have a choice. They're moving because of their own safety, for fear of their life. So it's essentially the economic migrants that are associated with the pull factors. These are things like looking for a better quality of life or standard of living, essentially varied employment opportunities, so a greater diversity of employment opportunities, as well as higher wages, and better healthcare and education, and better political stability and better life prospects. And if we're looking at retirees, a lot of time, if people have the money to, when they retire, they will move to another country. So we have the pull factors of specific environments. For old people, this might be moving to hotter climates and also a different range of services to care for their needs. So now I'm going to give you a bit of background about the European migrant crisis, which is currently happening, and it began in 2015, and this is related to the civil war in Syria and also in relation to ISIS. So the majority of people in the European migrant crisis, they're not economic migrants, they are refugees and asylum seekers trying to escape Syria and other countries in the Middle East for fear of persecution and being killed by rebel forces and ISIS. And as you can see, this is the map here representing the movements of migrants across Europe from Syria. They often go through Turkey and they end up in southern Europe, and they move their way across to countries like the UK, Sweden. The majority of migrants are currently held in Germany and France. There's a lot in Greece and Italy, and essentially they are all fleeing Syria and other countries in northern Africa for fear of their lives. And these are just some photographs here to show you the severity of the situation. Essentially, over 3 million refugees have fled from the civil war in Syria since 2011, and people are essentially doing anything they can to leave. They're taking risky measures such as travelling in overcrowded boats, illegally trying to reach some of the islands in Greece and around Italy and Turkey, just to escape the situation that's occurring in Syria at the moment. And despite the kind of conditions they have to live in when they reach their destination countries, like living in these refugee camps and the trouble they have to go through to get there, these negatives of the transport and the process of arriving in the destination country outweigh the negatives of staying in their home country in Syria and Iraq and all those other countries, because they are essentially, their lives are at risk if they stay there any longer, so they're willing to take this risk. And a lot of Syrian children and other family members have died on their journeys across here. This was a very famous photo from the media of a toddler who died on the crossing being carried up the beach. So obviously this is a very significant situation, and it's the worst migrant or refugee crisis the world has seen in recent decades. So now I'm going to move on to look at some of the implications of migration. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, any notable forms of migration, even as big or small as the European migrant crisis is, will have implications for the country of origin and for the destination country as well. In first instance, the population side is going to change, as well as the population structure. And so now I'm going to move on to look at some of the pros and cons for both the home country and the country of destination. So with regards to the home country, I'm going to divide the impacts up into social, economic, political, environmental, health and demographic consequences. So in terms of the demographics of the home country, which means kind of the population statistics, they will suffer from lower birth rates, and people of childbearing age are the ones that are going to be leaving the elderly people behind. So the population structure is going to either remain the same, and there's going to be an overall aging population. The population is not going to grow, especially because of the loss of males of working age as well moving abroad, because they're the people that have the best ability to do so. Socially, the main advantages of people fleeing the home country is that there will be a reduced pressure on healthcare systems and on education as well, but essentially the social negatives weigh out against the benefits, because they'll suffer from a loss of traditional culture, the breakup of families and communities, and the country is definitely going to lose many of their skilled and qualified workers, including doctors, nurses and teachers as well. Economically, the advantages are reduced pressure on the resources of food, energy and water. There'll be less unemployment, and sometimes remittances will be sent back from people, the migrants, back to their families who remain in the home country. So they benefit economically from that, but also they will essentially lose most of their skilled workforce. There will be increased number of dependent people. There'll be less agricultural and industrial production, as well as the decline in services, because there are not enough people to support them if the population is aging and it's all the old people with not very much money left behind. Politically, there'll be pressure to redevelop areas that are in decline, and also they may introduce pronatal policies to encourage people to start having more children. And environmentally, a lot of farmland and buildings and whole villages might be abandoned because of the migrant movements, and also there might be less environmental management overall, which could lead to increased pollution. And health-wise, migrants are going to be leaving areas where infectious diseases might be more common, so also there'll be less pressure on health services, but negatively there will be the most dependent people and often the most sick people left behind, so these people will be remaining at risk. So now looking at the implications for host countries, which are the countries where migrants are moving to, we'll look at some of the implications there. So demographically, there will be a balance of population structure. If the population was previously aging, with their influx of the younger kind of male populations from other countries, this is going to balance out the population structure, and it might also end up increasing the birth rate because there'll be more young people of fertile age and they'll start having children as well. Socially, the only advantage is that it will encourage the spread of culture, and in the host countries there'll be the cultural advantages of new foods, music and fashion and so on. But the negatives outweigh the benefits essentially, because there'll be much more pressure on maternal and infant healthcare, pressure on schools, because especially primary schools with the influx of children. Also, it's thought that young male migrants might create social problems, and it can also lead to rise in ethnic and racial tensions as well, increased crime rates, and sometimes increased segregation of migrants into certain areas and essentially not accepted into communities. Economically, the advantages is that there'll be any labour shortages will be overcome by this influx of young male workers. It might provide cheap labour forces who will work longer hours for lower pay. Working migrants will also be spending money and paying taxes, so that's going to benefit the economy. And also there'll be reduced dependency. So in previous videos we learnt about the concept of demographic dividends, when there's more economically active people than dependents, so this will cause a boom to the economy. But the disadvantages economically are pressures on jobs and unemployment. If there's more people of economic actively age but the same number of jobs, obviously there's going to be unemployment. And also there might be resentment towards migrants in times of recession, especially if migrants are thought to be taking jobs away from the people who originally lived in the home country. Then politically, there might be pressures to control immigration, the rise of anti-immigration political parties who are against migrants coming into the country, and the growth of right-wing racist organisations as well. Environmentally, there'll be pressure on land for development, for building new homes, roads, housing and other infrastructure to support the increase in population, and also simultaneously an increased demand for resources such as energy, water, food, and this is going to put pressure on natural resources. And then finally, in terms of the health implications, there might be an increase in infectious diseases transmitted by migrants, because they might have brought diseases with them from their home country to the host country and spread them in the host country. And this might lead to increased pressure on health services because of the rise in infectious diseases, and also increased pressure on health services to treat non-communicable or chronic diseases as well. Because of the notion of health tourism, some people travel to other countries because they think another country has a better health system in place and is a better place to get certain operations done that they need. So that puts pressure on health services as well, but that's more in relation to economic migrants. Now that we've looked at the implications on the home and host countries, we're going to look at the implications of migration on population structure. And population structure massively changes in relation to migration. And we can see this on this population pyramid of the United Arab Emirates for 2016. And their population has been greatly changed in structure due to the influx of young male workers into the country for work opportunities. It's not related to asylum seekers or anything like that. It's merely economic migrants moving into Dubai, especially young males. So as you can see, this is reflected in this huge, disproportionately a large amount of males at economically active ages in comparison to women, especially, and of this age group. So essentially they are in a period of demographic dividend, which we learned about in previous videos, when the number of economically active people are greater than the number of dependents, the old people and the very young people. So they're going to have increased spending, and this will boost the economy. So there'll essentially be reduced dependency. The birth rate will also increase from the increased number of adults and young adults. This has caused a gender imbalance that we can see in proportion to the number of females and the number of males. It's not a very even pyramid on either side. However, the economy might not benefit as much as we think from this influx of young male workers, because they might be sending money home to their home country, which might offset the effects of the economic boom of having this disproportionately large number of young male workers migrating into the United Arab Emirates. Now we're going to look at the implications on health, and this is divided into two different sections. The first being disease transmission and also implications for health services. In terms of disease transmission, this might be a push or pull factor for migrants leaving countries. They might leave a country because of the number of infectious diseases there and the risks to their health, and also the better health standards or in other countries. So for example, in European countries, there are lower numbers of infectious diseases in comparison to Africa, where they suffer from diseases very commonly like malaria and HIV/AIDS and so on. And also the main one that we've seen implication from migration is the transmission of TB. Now, TB was thought to have been almost eradicated in the UK in the 1980s, but recently, now that we've seen a greater rise in migration into the UK, the rise of tuberculosis has started to grow again, and there's been a greater number of cases of tuberculosis in the UK, and this is thought to have been linked to the rise in migration into the UK. However, reports also suggest that this has been exacerbated by poorer socioeconomic status and living conditions of the migrants in the UK, and this is leading to the spread of tuberculosis as well. And it's really led to the gradual re-emergence of tuberculosis as a public health problem in the UK, when it was previously thought that it had almost been eradicated. And then in terms of health services, it's thought that economic migrants are actually not very much of a burden on health services at all. They're very much a small burden. And this is because they're likely to be relatively light to moderate users of health services in their destination country. They're also most likely to be quite young, healthy, employed, and working in professional roles. They might even be working in the healthcare sector themselves. However, some migrants do place greater demands on parts of the health service, and this is associated with social deprivation. For example, as I was just talking about, the higher incidence of TB, and this can also be exacerbated by poor English language skills and a lack of knowledge of the health system, so which might place extra stress on health systems like the NHS in the United Kingdom. And there is also mixed evidence of health behaviours and the lifestyle of migrants impacting upon healthcare and the services available, because sometimes migrants might not have very good lifestyles. They might smoke a lot and drink a lot, which will impact their health negatively, and their health may deteriorate over time depending on their length of stay. But in their later life, they might suffer from more kind of chronic diseases, and this will put strains on the healthcare services available. Now we're going to answer an exam style question to assess the factors that might account for the spatial variation shown on the map below for 9 marks. And this is a map of the asylum applicants in Europe, and it shows their countries of origin, with the colours representing the number of migrants applying from each of these countries shown, but it only applies to Africa and Asia. South America and North America have not been included in this map, and it tells us some of the top 15 countries of origins of asylum seekers, with Syria up at the top. And as we know, this is because of the civil war in Syria. A lot of the countries at the top are in relation to civil war and other political instabilities such as Afghanistan, Kosovo, Eritrea, but also we have other countries that are high on the asylum applicants list, and this relates to other political instability such as countries like Somalia as well. So now essentially we're going to analyse the patterns in relation to those asylum seekers applying to live in the European Union, which is this grey region here. And as we can see, the very dark colours are where we're getting the highest number of applicants, and the lower or the lighter colours, such as these yellow areas, are where we're getting very low or zero applicants from. So first of all, I'm going to start describing the patterns and trends we can see on the map, and then later on in my answer, I'm going to provide a bit of analysis to this. So this map shows the origin of asylum applicants in the EU, and then I'm going to define asylum seeker. So these are people who claim to be at risk of persecution but have not been yet granted refugee status. The figure indicates that the majority of asylum seekers originate from low-income countries. Now I'm going to talk about why asylum seekers choose to move and their reasons for migration. So I said asylum seekers choose to migrate for fear of political prosecution, gender-based violence, as well as natural disasters. They are attracted to the EU because of their policies as well as the economic opportunities available. So this is one of the reasons for why this asylum seeking kind of trends are taking place. So now moving on, I'm going to discuss some of the data from the graph. And I've said the top origins of asylum seekers come from areas of conflict, such as Syria and Afghanistan. So this is using some of your own knowledge about a kind of political trends at the moment and current affairs. And then I've said similarly, Eritrea and Somalia are countries that suffer political instability. Poverty levels are also important factors, with migrants moving from low-income to high-income countries, which explains the high and medium levels across Africa and Asia. So here, essentially in this paragraph, I've discussed the push factors from the low-income countries and the reasons why they are opting to become asylum seekers and seek asylum in the EU. Now I'm moving into a bit of analysis to analyse these trends that I've just pointed out. So I've said conflict is likely to be the single biggest reason for the pattern of asylum seekers, as they are primarily concerned with escaping prosecution or war in the Middle East. Push factors are thus likely to be prominent in the decision to migrate rather than the pull factors. So that's essentially a big statement saying that these people are leaving their countries because of the fear of prosecution rather than the attractiveness of living in the EU. They're moving there for their own safety. And then, aside from war, political or religious persecution is likely to account for the large number of asylum seekers from parts of Africa and the Middle East. I'm then continuing my analysis in the next paragraph, stating that another reason for these migration patterns could be linked to wealth, since European countries typically have high GDPs, whilst the countries of origin are very low-income countries such as Pakistan, Bangladesh and Nigeria. Thus, there is a correlation between the world's poorest countries and the number of asylum seekers. And then finally, to finish off, it's good to have a concluding statement, especially in these 9-mark questions. So I've said overall, the patterns and processes affecting the source of origin of asylum seekers varies within and between countries. The pressures to flee from fear of persecution is likely to be greater than the influence of pull factors. So I've essentially summarised what I've said in the rest of my answer.
Hi guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're looking for an amazing A-level geography resource, join me today in my series of engaging bite-sized video tutorials. See you soon, and together let's make A-level geography a walk in the park.